Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be looking at compliance in practice. My name's Janet Anderson. I am the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting right the way around Australia and paying my respects to elders past and present, and indeed extending those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us for today's webinar. As I said, today we're going to be talking about compliance, and judging by the number of registrants we'd had, I think it's a topic of keen interest to many of you. Compliance is a central feature or requirement of any regulatory system. The rules or obligations are determined typically by Parliament through legislation to safeguard some specified public interest. Now, in our case, that is to protect and enhance the safety, health, well-being and quality of life of all those people who receive aged care. And then the regulator, the Commission, is charged with ensuring that the rules and the obligations are complied with. So for all of us working in aged care, the most important set of rules or obligations are the aged care quality standards. And so compliance with the standards is key. And where the Commission sees a provider falling short of their obligations under the quality standards, our aim is to bring that to the provider's attention and prompt them to address the non-compliance in a timely manner. But while compliance is essential, it's not sufficient. In social care systems around the world, compliance is always paired with an expectation for continuous improvement. So in today's session, we're going to look at the link between risk assessment, compliance enforcement, and continuous improvement. And we'll be discussing what we consider when forming a view on risk and whether we should take enforcement action as the Commission, and how we build a picture of a provider's capability, capacity, and potential willingness to do what's needed to take action required to address non-compliance. You'll also hear about our case management processes, what the Commission's intention is throughout that part of the cycle, and what we expect from you as a provider when we assess progress towards compliance. And after that, we'll turn our attention to home services and the elements we look at in terms of building our evidence base. So there's a fair bit to get through, and at the end of all of that, and I have a number of panellists who will assist me through it, we will have a question and answer session, which I'll come to in a minute. But first, to introduce the panel, today I'm very pleased to have joining me 4 representatives from the Commission: Peter Edwards, who's an Executive Director, Amanda Innes-Brown, Director Compliance, Lucy Fallon, Director Home Care Compliance, and Scott Rumbold, Director Compliance Case Management. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get underway. You can ask questions, and I hope you do, at any time by clicking the blue raised hand icon, I'm told, towards the top of your screen. We will be sharing today's slides with everyone who registered to attend. And during the slides presentation, if you want to make the slides full screen, you can do that by hovering your cursor over the slides, and you'll see a square icon in the top right-hand corner, which, if you click on it, will increase the size of the slides. And if you want to click it on again, you return to the combined slides in camera view. So we do have a short survey at the end of the webinar. I encourage you to participate and complete it. We do pay close attention to the feedback of webinar participants to improve our own performance and to understand what worked and what didn't work for you. I'm now pleased to hand over to Peter to get things moving on all matters compliance. Thanks, Peter.
Look, thanks so much, Janet, and it is really genuinely good to be with you all. And as Janet said, there's obviously a lot of interest out there around how we manage non-compliance, and so I'm really pleased to have some of my staff that work in the group that work with providers that both in the home services and residential areas who are struggling with non-compliance. So look, I'll start by saying that we recognise that there is a perception among some providers that when we take enforcement action or use our enforcement powers, they are designed in some way to punish them for being non-compliant with their aged care obligations. I want to make it clear at the outset that that is not the case. Although enforcement powers are obviously used when the, non-compliance is present, our decision to take enforcement action is based on the level of risk we consider the non-compliance is or will cause consumers without the Commission actively oversighting the provider's remediation plan. Where we consider the risk of non-compliance is lower, that provides opportunity because it gives us scope to leave the provider to take remedial action with less direct oversight from us. So risk is really central to helping us understand where we should direct resource and versus where we can leave a provider to remediate, perhaps with less intensive scrutiny. And so how we assess risk is important, and that's what my colleague Amanda is going to talk about shortly. For now, it's useful to mention that one important consideration that influences how we assess risk is our trust in the provider's capability, capacity, and willingness to actively address the identified non-compliance. And you will see that as a theme that flows through all of the presentations. And that's because our goal is to see all forms of non-compliance addressed. At times, this will mean that our regulatory response to the same type of non-compliance may be different, as our previous dealings with one provider might suggest that little progress is likely to be made without some active engagement and monitoring by us. And so that suggests risk, and that then influences how we rate the level of risk in relation to that provider. So by assessing risk well, it helps us manage most non-compliance as efficiently as possible, and that in turn ensures that we have the capacity to concentrate a greater proportion of our time and resources on those providers that require closer supervision to safeguard consumers. So what we look for when we engage with providers is evidence of their commitment through their actions to mitigate risks and continuously improve, as Janet just said. Those that can demonstrate this ultimately get to exert greater control over what the Commission does next. So even where our starting point with the provider involves us using our most significant powers, for example, when we find consumers at risk of immediate and severe harm, our hope is that they will quickly give us the evidence that we need to be able to de-escalate our level of regulatory oversight. Because if they're able to do that, it means that those risks that are starting, it means that those risks are starting to be actively controlled, making care safer and better for consumers, which is ultimately what our regulatory model is about. So that's the theory. I'm now going to hand over to Amanda, who is the Director responsible for intake and assessment, who will explain her role and how her staff make decisions about whether to take enforcement action. Over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Peter. I'll start by describing how providers come to our attention for possible enforcement action. Although my focus is on residential providers, my colleague Lucy, who will be speaking shortly, has a team that performs a similar role in relation to home services. The starting point for us is a referral from another area of the Commission. A key referral area is the Quality Assessment and Monitoring Group, or QAM for short, which regularly sends matters our way to assess next steps where there's evidence that existing non-compliance is posing an unacceptable risk to consumers. Recently, there's been a repositioning of some responsibilities between the Compliance Management Group and QAM that's enabled QAM to respond directly to and manage lower risk non-compliance in a way that maximises the incentives for providers to take remedial action with less direct involvement from the Commission. That builds on something that Peter said earlier about the Commission's commitment to ensuring we're regulating in a manner that supports efficient rectification of non-compliance. That's good for the provider and the Commission, and most importantly, helps generate the outcome consumers and their families want, a provider that's committed to actively working to continuously improve their services. What I'll do now is take you through the types of things we consider when we receive a referral for potential enforcement action. I'll start with matters that get referred to us where there are concerns about immediate and severe risk. These types of referrals will usually come to us when an audit or monitoring visit is happening and actual harm is being observed, or there's objective evidence of uncontrolled risk related to non-compliance with aged care obligations. Under our legislation, we must act quickly to ensure appropriate steps are taken to protect consumers in situations like this. Indeed, the Commission Act requires us to first exclude the presence of immediate and severe risk before we're allowed to consider issuing a non-compliance notice. Generally, if harm or severe uncontrolled risk has been identified, the question we focus on is whether the risk of harm is sufficiently current to pass the immediacy test. As immediate is not defined in the Act, we apply a common sense interpretation of the term, which is where the identified risk is sufficiently recent to warrant us directing the service to take a specific course of action to protect consumers. Where we make a judgment that the nature of harm or risk is severe and warrants urgent intervention, we'll issue a notice to agree, plus or minus a sanction, to ensure that the provider promptly implements mitigation strategies and avoids the risk of any further harm. Usually that's done by requiring a provider to appoint an eligible advisor. At times we may also consider it necessary to contain the level of risk by preventing a service from taking on new consumers through imposing a sanction that prohibits any new aged care subsidies. Unfortunately, immediate and severe risk isn't found very often, so most of the time we're making a broader assessment of risk based on other information available to us. In working through that information, our goal is to understand the nature of the risk and which regulatory pathway is needed to drive required behavioural change by the provider. We work to anticipate different regulatory decisions we might need to make, subject to the provider's action or inaction along the way. It's important as that helps us paint a picture for a provider of the different regulatory pathways. My colleague Scott will talk more about that shortly. And for now, I'll explain the factors my team considers in deciding whether to issue a non-compliance notice or potentially a compliance notice. We start by looking at the referral that's been sent to us and the reasons the referrer considers enforcement action might be warranted. That's just the starting point though, as our decision to take enforcement action isn't just because a provider has been found to be non-compliant. Rather, the decision we're making is that the risk of the non-compliance is such that formal enforcement action is required to ensure the Commission is able to actively supervise the remediation process to safeguard consumers. That's why we work to look at everything we know about the service and the provider. My team generally considers information around the persistence of risk. So that means whether the provider has been found non-compliant with the same requirements in the past and whether previous remediation efforts have been unsuccessful. Volume and type of complaints. Specifically, we look at concerns that are relevant to the current non-compliance, but also the provider's willingness to engage in the resolution process. We look at incidents that we're aware of through the Serious Incident Response Scheme. Again, specifically, we look at incidents that illustrate the non-compliance and the provider's capacity to manage it. We also consider workforce data, the organisation's governance arrangement, star rating information, particularly consumer survey data, and any financial and prudential risks we're aware of. All those things help us build a picture of a provider's capability, capacity, and potential willingness to do what's needed to take action to address the causes of non-compliance. In reviewing all this information, we do give a reasonable amount of weight to what we call a provider's regulatory posture, where our past dealings with a provider have been positive and they've demonstrated a commitment to change and then followed through in making that change. That gives us confidence that they do it again if given the opportunity. Whereas a provider that's been cyclically non-compliant and highly defensive in our past dealings, will lead us to be concerned about the risk of leaving them to remediate their non-compliance without close oversight by us. In cases where we assess the risk as high, we're most likely to issue a non-compliance notice, or where the issue relates to restrictive practices, code of conduct or incident management problems, a compliance notice. When we've made a decision to initiate formal regulatory action, someone from my team will generally phone the provider in advance of them receiving the notice to let them know what's happening and why. We're also actively working to significantly improve the way we draft our notices to ensure they're written in plain English and make clear the issues we're concerned about so the provider knows what we want them to address. From there, we hand over the case to our case management team. Before I invite Scott in, I'll just quickly mention something my team is working on with people from across the Commission that might lead a provider to be contacted by us outside the standard compliance process. We're looking across the sector to identify areas of provider risk where we might not yet have established the presence of non-compliance. This is something that's important to the Commission as it shifts us onto a preventative footing by enabling us to flag concerns that might not otherwise be visible to the provider. This approach is now possible because of the large volume of information available to us. It helps us understand relative risk between providers in relation to discrete issues. In most cases, we expect our regulatory response will be educative, with potential formal action only being used where a provider is reluctant or resistant to address an issue. I'll now hand over to my colleague Scott, who will talk about what happens next.
Thanks, Amanda. So once a notice is issued to a provider, what are the next steps? What do we want you to do? And how will the Commission engage with you? Before I jump into the process, I want to be clear about the intent of the case management team during the engagement period. The case management team will always look to work with providers and not against them. We are not trying to catch providers out, and we want to see providers succeed. And we will be open and clear about a provider's regulatory pathway. Now, once we have initiated formal regulatory action, what are the next steps? To begin with, the mere fact the Commission has taken compliance action means there needs to be a general acceptance that non-compliance exists. We get very concerned when we engage with a provider and despite documented evidence, they are dismissive about the identified problems. These situations are challenging, but we will seek to work through the provider's concerns. From here, our focus is always going to be about what the provider is doing to address the non-compliance, something that we call the rectification pathway. That pathway will differ and depend on the level of risk and the regulatory action that we have taken. Now we'll touch on two types of regulatory action the case management team manages. The first is where we issue a notice to agree to certain matters. Our initial engagement is going to be intense because of the level of risk and because we are directing the provider to do something. Examples including directing the provider to appoint an advisor or directing them not to take on any more consumers for a period of time. We will be looking for evidence of immediate changes at the surface to reduce the risk posed to consumers. This might include, for example, an immediate review of consumers' care plans and changes to the care being provided. We understand these situations are difficult for providers as they can generate anxiety for staff and consumers. Where needed, we will provide advice about how to communicate with your staff and consumers. Experience shows that the most reassuring approach for consumers and staff is when providers are open and honest about their problems and steps that they are taking to fix them. It's even better when providers involve consumers and staff in planning and implementing the required improvements. In most cases, the provider will arrange a face-to-face meeting with the consumers and their representatives. I've attended several of these meetings and they provide a great forum, firstly for the provider to show that they are taking responsibility for the change. It also provides an opportunity for the Commission to reassure consumers that we'll be monitoring the provider in relation to the progress that the provider makes. These meetings also allow the consumers the opportunity to share their experiences directly with the provider and should assist the provider in fine-tuning their remedial action. The second notice that I will touch on today is where the Commission has issued a non-compliance notice. This notice initially puts the ball in the provider's court and allows them to set out their plan to rectify the identified non-compliance. The amount of time providers get to submit their remediation plan depends on the level of risk. The maximum period for a response to a non-compliance notice is 14 days. However, where the risk is high, the response time will be shorter to ensure we have full visibility of any actions taken, as well as any future actions. Where we are very concerned about the risks, we will generally meet with the provider quite quickly to discuss their response to ensure we have a full understanding of what actions are being taken. Any further action taken by the Commission will be heavily informed by the suitability of these plans and these initial conversations. It is important to note that we, the Commission, are not expecting a perfect response. What we do expect is a genuine commitment from the provider to understand the underlying causes of the non-compliance and a recognition that this will require a level of behavioural change on their part. To illustrate this with an actual experience, we had a provider who gave every indication that they were very committed to addressing the non-compliance, but were really struggling to understand what they needed to do to rectify the non-compliance. The case management team supported the provider by providing feedback on their remediation plan and asked them to think about the root cause of the issues. We also suggested that the provider seek external assistance to support them with the changes. The provider took up these suggestions and they provided useful and got them on the path to addressing the non-compliance. What providers can expect from us, the case management branch, is a no surprises approach. From the outset, we will work hard to make sure that we're as clear as possible about the potential regulatory pathways available to each provider. Generally, there will be two such pathways. The first path is where our regulatory interests diminish in response to progress made, and the other pathway is where our interests actually increase in response to poor progress or poor commitment. In all cases, we are committed to engaging with providers until we are satisfied the risk of non-compliance is adequately controlled. We will develop an individualised case management plan for each provider based on the outcomes we need to achieve and the level of identified risk to consumers. In almost all cases, there will be regular, virtual or face-to-face meetings with the provider to discuss how they're progressing in rectifying the non-compliance. In working with you, our compliance officers will draw on the Commission's resources and expertise to provide guidance and enable us to assess the reasonableness of your progress. One challenging area that is currently evident in a number of cases is responding effectively to a consumer's challenging behaviour and understanding the obligations around the use of restrictive practices. Our compliance officers will seek expert advice from the Commission's Restrictive Practices Unit and in some instances actually arrange for them to deal directly with providers. Another area that we're seeing at the moment is where we've provided assistance and also arranged training session is around the Serious Incident Response Scheme, or SIRS, as you might know it. The compliance officer will often ask for evidence to validate the actions being taken by the provider. This could include policy documents, training records, and governance frameworks. At times, compliance officers will even visit a service and speak to the relevant staff and consumers. These visits may also be conducted by a quality assessment team. The evidence gathered during our engagement with providers informs our decision about when the regulatory action can be finalised. When we make that decision, we need to be confident that the required changes have been made and that they are sustainable. We are really looking to break the cycle of non-compliance. To achieve that, it is essential that the changes are not cosmetic. I know that's been quite a lot of information, but I hope that gives you an overview of what to expect when we undertake regulatory action. I will now hand over to Lucy, who is the Director of our Home Services Compliance team, and will take you through a couple of case studies.
Thank you, Scott, and good afternoon, everyone. You have heard the phrases risk proportionate and provider posture throughout today's presentation, and you would be well familiar with the famous regulatory pyramid, which is prominently featured in our compliance and enforcement policy, with its pointy ends firmly pointing towards revocation. Well, we are now using a regulatory diamond, which highlights the importance of pushing beyond mere compliance and towards best practice. Today, I would like to tell you two stories that started in a similar way and ended quite differently. Hopefully, they will reinforce some of the things others have spoken about in relation to the importance of provider posture. Following a quality audit of a home care provider whose service delivery model was underpinned by self-managed packages and subcontracted care and service delivery, the Commission found extensive failures. The root cause of the provider's failures was the failure to implement adequate governance structures to ensure its subcontractors delivered safe care and services to consumers. The result was non-compliance with 24 requirements across 7 of the aged care quality standards that posed severe and immediate risk of harm to consumers. The Commission issued the provider with a notice to agree, which imposed a number of requirements on the provider, including to appoint an advisor to work with the Commission and the provider to address the identified failures. In the months that followed, we engaged with the provider and the advisor regularly to support them both to identify and implement strategies to course correct, but also to mitigate the risk of recurrence. We also secured on-the-ground support at the provider's location. Unfortunately, the provider did not capitalize on the opportunity. They failed to address our concerns and implement adequate controls to manage the risk of harm, resulting in continued non-compliant behavior to a point where the risk of harm to consumers became unacceptable. As a result, we were left with no other option than to revoke the entity's approved provider status. Now, this happens very rarely, but it can happen in circumstances such as those I have outlined. Now, the provider in the second story ended up differently. They also had failures, not only across multiple requirements of the quality standards, but also across the broader provider responsibilities. The initial engagement with this provider led us towards the top of the regulatory pyramid to a point where we imposed a 3-month sanction preventing the provider from accepting new consumers. The reasons for our action were similar to those in the first story. What happened next, however, was different. The sanction was a turning point in how this provider viewed their problems, causing a shift in their posture towards the management of the non-compliance. The provider started engaging with us in a meaningful way and implemented treatments and controls to address the causes of non-compliance and to reduce the risk of harm to consumers. The provider came to our meetings well prepared and were open about barriers to progress and how they intended to overcome them. They told us how they would measure their progress and provided evidence of improvements, and I have to tell you, their improvements were evident at every point of our engagement. The provider's willingness to course correct and ability to demonstrate progress through evidence positioned them to better manage future issues before they became problems. Now, today, this provider delivers care and services to older Australians in a way that is safe and compliant. And we're fairly confident that over time, they won't settle for just that and will reach for better. I hope the regulatory story demonstrates to you the power of approaching non-compliance with the right mindset, as it is that mindset that determines how the regulatory story unfolds. Thank you all, and back to you, Janet.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lucy. And indeed, thank you to all the panelists. And it's really great that we have lots of time to take your questions. So just a reminder, you can submit your questions, and please do, because we do have some time and we have some experts on the panel who are standing ready to answer them. Peter, perhaps I can come to you first. A couple of you, and certainly Scott, used the language of a no surprises approach to compliance. And there may be some people watching this who are wanting a bit more information in order to understand the way in which we're deploying that phrase. Can you help them out, please?
Look, thanks, Janet. And and I just echo what Janet said. Please submit questions, because we've intentionally tried to make sure that we scoot through the content to provide ample opportunity for people to ask questions. So please take advantage of that if you can. But look, a no surprises approach is linked to the outcome that we're trying to achieve. At the end of the day, we want a safe, high quality sector, and in order to achieve a safe, high quality sector, there needs to be some level of behavioural change, because a lot of these obligations are really mitigations to protect the consumer's interests. So we've got a genuine desire to ensure that providers understand what they need to do and what success and failure looks like, so that they can actively participate in a process and make decisions about how they course correct. And Lucy's is an example, 2 examples of a provider who took that opportunity and who didn't. We've got no interest in driving a provider out of the sector. Our desire is that a provider will engage with what they need to do and continuously improve. And so there is no point in us keeping anything a secret from the provider, because that isn't going to help them think about how they need to work differently. So where we do, so what that might look like at a basic level is when Amanda group issues a notice. In most cases we will phone a provider now in advance of sending the notice, so that the provider understands the context, understands why it's been issued, and to have a conversation. And that obviously then makes it easier when it's received, because then a provider can already be prepared in thinking through how they might respond to that. Where there is ongoing failure, it will be a story of opportunity given and opportunity squandered. Now, how quickly that occurs would obviously depend on the level of risk that particular service is managing. But at every point, we want a provider to be able to make a compelling case to us about why we should start to de-escalate our sort of level of regulatory oversight, because that's ultimately, good for the provider, easier for us, but most importantly, good for the consumers at the end of that care. So that's probably, hopefully that's enough. Does that sort of touch on what you were sort of asking to get at, Janet?
Yeah, Peter. Staying with you just briefly on that last point about looking for reasons to de-escalate. Just to elaborate slightly, what are the sorts of things we're looking for? And you might go to evidence, but you might also go to posture. Just rehearse some of that with us again, so that everyone online is really clear about what would convince us that this is a provider who understands what they need to do and is getting about doing it.
Yeah, look, it's about, like in any walk of life, it's about having a growth mindset. You can, and so what what Scott touched on is it's looking at the willingness of the provider to engage with their problems and recognise, and first and foremost recognise that they've got a problem that they need to fix, because that's obviously an important starting point. And then really working with us in doing the things that so in putting forward a rectification plan that usually comes with a number of different promises about things that will be delivered at certain points, and so we're keenly looking at evidence that those things that have been promised have been delivered. Sometimes that will be around the development of policies and procedures or training, but also we're very keen, because we want to avoid sort of this cyclical non-compliance. We want to avoid sort of cosmetic treatment of problems. We will also at times go and look at the effectiveness of some of those things. So that might involve us, talking to staff, understanding, getting an understanding of that a new policy that might have been implemented, their understanding of that policy and how it applies to their day-to-day work. So we're looking at a range of different things, but I think and I think it goes to what Scott mentioned at the outset. We're not looking for perfection. We recognise that delivering care is complex, but what we are looking for is a willingness to engage in fixing those problems. And where we see that, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the provider will get a lot more control over what happens next.
Good point. Thank you. All right. Next question is one for you, Scott. You talked very compellingly about us being interested in the provider disclosing what might have gone wrong to their consumers, the people to whom they provide care, and ideally engaging with that group in the problem solving and in the development of rectification strategies. So if there are things that need fixing, the care recipients, the consumers, are party to the planning and implementation of that fix, as it were. And you also mentioned residents and relatives meetings, which of course is particular to residential services. And it seems to me that is a really important opportunity for a provider to embrace the chance of improvement. Now, I know that sounds a bit Pollyanna, and I don't mean it that way, because as Peter has said, this is challenging. Delivering aged care is not a walk in the park. But the residents and relative meeting is the opportunity for a provider to say, this is what the Commission's found, and this is what we want to do to fix it. How can we draw you into this process, and to give you trust and confidence that we know what we need to do and we're going to do it? So, Scott, I finally get to the question. You've attended a few of these now, and I wonder whether, without notice from me, you might just be able to offer some reflections on the really good meetings that you've been to. And I know you've been to a mixed bag. Some of them haven't gone as well. But what are the characteristics of a really good residents and relatives meeting from your perspective?
Thanks, Janet. Yes, I've been with the Commission just over a year, and I've attended quite a few residents and relatives meetings now. Usually that's in response where the Commission is taking, I guess, quite a strong regulatory response to non-compliance. A good residents and relatives meeting, I guess it's a well-organised meeting with good attendance from both residents and representatives. The impact of COVID had a big impact. The impact of COVID reduced our ability to sometimes do on-site meetings, but now, we're managing the outbreak of COVID. We managed to get on-site, and I find it a very beneficial experience to be there, to represent the Commission, or if it's not myself, one of my colleagues, to be there to represent the Commission and to talk about the findings of the assessment team. Usually in a good residents meeting, the provider will talk honestly about the issues that has been found and some of their shortcomings, and also talks about the pathway forward. It also provides the Commission an opportunity to talk about our mission and our purpose and what our role will be. Usually there'll be some heavy monitoring and oversight, which does provide the residents and their family members the reassurance that there'll be some oversight and the service will be able to turn things around. We usually have representatives from OPAM there, which is very handy to have somebody looking after the consumer and having a voice for them. And then the second half of the meeting, it's essentially like a question and answer forum where we open the floor. That's probably what I've personally got the biggest benefit out of these sessions, is where we've had really good, honest conversation, where it's a very safe space. The consumers and the representatives have shared some very honest and sometimes heartbreaking experiences that they've had within that residential service. Those stories and experience usually validate the findings of the assessment team. And in those good sessions, it's where the provider stands up and takes responsibilities, apologises for those shortcomings, and again has a forward-looking focus in terms of how to rectify those issues. The residents meeting, as I say, they're usually at the start of a regulatory process, but we encourage providers to hold them regularly throughout our engagement with them, because it provides a good opportunity even to see the progress being made. I've had the pleasure and the lucky opportunity to be able to come back towards the end of a regulatory pathway, speak to the same consumers, and for them to thank me on behalf of the Commission about seeing things improve. And it's one of the things that I love about the job and the role that the Commission does.
Oh, wonderful. I'm going to stay with you briefly. There are a couple of other questions and people are hitting their stride now. Thank you for the questions. They're coming in and it's good to have them. Scott, we've been asked by Kay to clarify the difference between a notice of non-compliance and a compliance notice. Now, can you give us the short form explanation of the distinction between those two?
Yes. So non-compliance notice is essentially, it talks about the commission or the commissioner is thinking about imposing sanctions, and there's a pathway thereafter. Usually the approach for non-compliance notices is to do with the aged care quality standards, where the compliance notice focuses on the aged care, the quality of safety principles, which is a different focus, and that's around incident management, restrictive practices, and also non-compliance with the code of conduct. So there's sort of different scopes in scopes of application between those two compliance notices.
All right, well done. We do understand some of the complexities of the language we use, and we're always up to provide the explanations if you are at all concerned or mystified by the tool that we're deploying for a particular purpose. Now, I have some workforce questions here, and I might invite Peter to comment. I might open the batting. The question that Samantha's asked is how we will deal with a provider who is unable to provide 24/7 RN cover, but has risk mitigation strategies in place. Now, this is a very contemporary question. We're 18 days into a new requirement for those of you who deliver residential services, who are now required to have an RN on duty around the clock, 24/7 on every shift. And we have put out into the sector, and I hope many, if not all of you, have had the chance of reading it or hearing it or watching it. We've put out a welter of information about the way in which we would seek to regulate this as a workforce-related responsibility that providers have. And the first thing I'd say is workforce-related responsibilities have always been part of the expectations that providers operate under, and that's because it's standard 7 in the aged care quality standards, human resources, right? So this is not novel. This is not something entirely out of the box, but care minutes responsibilities, 24/7 RN cover are very specific instances of that broader obligation that attaches to standard 7. And so we will always look to the effort that the provider is putting into ensuring that they comply, because compliance is essential. It's just not the only thing that we look at. We also look at risk of harm. Peter, I wonder at that point whether you'd pick up the threads and just provide a slightly expanded explanation of what we do specifically in relation to 24/7 RN cover.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. And Janet, I spoke at a webinar specifically on this topic going back a couple of months ago. So if you want an even more expanded answer, to look for that on our website. Yeah, so obviously there's this target state that providers, the government is funding providers to work towards around 24/7 RN coverage. But as the theme of today sort of indicates, you know, we make decisions about what enforcement action we take based on the level of risk we see that that non-compliance posing. So there might not be a compliance, strictly non-compliance with the requirement, but then there's a decision about what enforcement action is necessary. So what we are looking for in a case like this is evidence that there are suitable alternative arrangements in place to mitigate the risk of not having the coverage that you would otherwise have in place, in order that people can get the right type of care at the right time when they need it, which is really the intent of these targets. And where we see that a provider has really good mitigations in place, then our conclusion will be that the level of risk to consumers is lower, and therefore our decision to take specific enforcement action will be informed by that. and obviously what we're also looking for is that a provider has got a plan. I mean, a plan about how they will sort of work towards in time to achieve the target, because we recognise that depending on where you are, the ability to recruit is more difficult in some places than others. But it's going to be even more difficult if there's no plan. So we are looking that a provider will have a plan, and we know that some of those plans will take longer to fully implement than others because of the constraints within a particular area. So yes, so I think the key point I sort of want to make is that, where we need to, this is really a decision about where we need to actively work with a provider. If the level of if the risks associated with are being managed, then our confidence in that provider will be greater. But where we're not, then we will be looking to actively case manage. But it won't be about necessarily the care gaps from a 24/7 perspective. It will be about the lack of suitable mitigations to ensure that consumers get safe care when they and the right type of care when they need it.
Thank you. And hopefully those watching are getting a sense of the through line about the expectations we have of providers to understand where they have risk exposure and to be proactive in taking the necessary steps to address what otherwise might be perceived as a gap, and indeed placing consumers at risk of harm. There is so much agency that providers have in this regulatory setting. We really need you to understand that if you can take that action for yourselves and stay ahead of us, as it were, we are delighted. We would like that of all of you. Now, Amanda, I have a question for you. In your presentation, you talked about the matters for consideration when you are thinking about a potential action in compliance. And you talked about things like persistence of risk, volume and type of complaints, and so on. And I want to take you back to that list and ask you just to go through it with us again, because Anna has asked, how does the Commission ensure issues are identified earlier rather than waiting until there is potential risk to consumers? And it seems to me the list that you shared with us is another way of coming at that. What do we look at? What is available to us by way of intelligence and data, which allows us to come to an understanding and an evaluation or assessment of level of risk to consumers in that organisation at that time? Amanda.
Thanks, Janet. That's a very good question. So to take you through the list again, so in terms of persistence of risk, so that's one of the things we look at. So that's your past history or provider's past history of managing non-compliance where it's found. So where that has found to be not effective, then we understand that the risk is higher at that service. The likelihood is higher that the risks to residents will be realised. So moving on, in terms of volume and types of complaints, complaints are a very good I suppose, yardstick for us in terms of what understanding what the residents are feeling, what their families are seeing. That can be a really good number, indicator for us in terms of how the provider's managing risks and what those risks are on the floor. In terms of the serious incident response scheme, again, it's the same thing. We're looking at what's happening on a daily basis on the floor and how the provider is responding to those. So it's not just that incidents are happening. It's as I say, the key thing that we look at is how the provider is managing those, mitigating those risks, and making sure that they're not recurring. So in terms of workforce data, as Peter has talked about, one of the big indicators is having sufficient qualified and skilled staff available to provide the care. So we look at that information, which gives us an indication of where we should direct our efforts. In terms of governance arrangements, the Commission has a great deal of information on the impact of governance on quality care on the website if anyone's interested. But in short, where we see severe and immediate risks, it's often, the root causes often include that the governance at a service is disconnected from the care. So you might have a board that's not trained to understand how the care needs are being met, and there might not be any systems of review in place. So there's no one's checking on a monthly basis, for example, how care is trending, whether falls are increasing or decreasing, and no one's asking why. So governance and those arrangements in place are really important for us. Star ratings information, obviously, that goes to the consumers' views of what their care is, what the quality is, and any financial and prudential risks are also sometimes indicative of again a provider who might not be organising their organisation in a really effective manner. What I would also say, as well as that, so this is what I think about when things come to me. So the risks are already relatively high. So what I would also say is that the Commission, as I mentioned earlier, has a great deal of data from a great deal of different places, which we use, or our very skilled analysts use to make some decisions about where our quality assessment and monitoring group might prioritise their attention as well. So that's a really big way that we, at the moment, make sure that we're targeting the areas of highest likely risk.
All right, well done. A very comprehensive answer, and I know that would have been beneficial for people. Lucy, next one's for you. We are sometimes accused of not giving quite enough attention to home services providers. So I'm going to ask you a question specifically about that. And because this is your day-to-day bread and butter, definitely something that you would be expert to offer a view on. What are the most challenging compliance requirements that we identify for home care providers, or that they tell us they struggle most with? Can you give us an understanding of that, please?
Yes, thank you, Janet. I certainly can do that. And if I may just give attention to home care providers to link to Amanda's response and just add one tiny bit of information that we also use data matching and intelligence from other regulators, especially those responsible for like-minded programs. And that's how we do some proactive work to identify risk before it becomes too big of an issue. But back to the question, I think it's always good to have this opportunity to reflect on how one fares against the broader group. So going back to data and intelligence, our data and intelligence shows that home care providers find most challenging the exclusion and inclusion framework of the home care packages program, that is in relation to the broader provider responsibilities. And in relation to the quality standards, it is the requirements of Standard 8, and more specifically in relation to having adequate governance over care and services delivered by subcontractors. The why. I would put an overarching sort of statement of caution to say that one of the key contributing factors to the why of any compliance issue is a lack of appropriate governance. And if I can now break the why down to my response, in terms of the inclusion and exclusion framework, some providers have told us that they find it hard to determine those gray area items. But we also have providers who tell us they find it hard to say no to consumers. In terms of subcontractors, I think the difficulty comes from a lack of understanding that it is ultimately the provider who is responsible for the delivery of safe and quality care, which is provided under a Commonwealth-funded home care packages. And before I wrap up my answer, just a reminder to all of you out there that in 2022, the Commission published a resource for providers called Quality and Safety in Home Care, the 5 key areas of risk. This document outlines the current areas of risk in home care, and those of you who provide home services will find it quite useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. All right, back to you, Scott, for a quick one. I think Tina has asked whether we can explain what an eligible advisor to be appointed by provider means. Do you want to give us a quick explanation of that one?
Yes, Janet, thanks for that. Yes, so the term eligible advisor, it has appeared in legislation over the past few years. The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission Act sort of refers to, it's not sort of, it does refer to an eligible advisor. And it talks about a person who has appropriate qualifications, skills or experience to assist the provider comply with the provider's aged care responsibilities. So I guess in a nutshell, you know, if there's non-compliance or there's issues around restrictive practice, you'd be looking to get an eligible advisor with experience, skills and experience within the restrictive practices area. Yeah, so it's sort of within the Commission Act. There's some guidance around what an advisor is.
And I think we've also got an information sheet, Scott, on our website from memory.
Correct. Yes, there is. Yep, definitely. Yep, there is a fact sheet. Yep, there's something available on the Commission's website around.
So, Tina, my recommendation is jump on the website, use the search function, and see if you can bring it up and read through it. And by all means, get back in touch if you continue to have questions. Okay, we're coming to the end. I'm going to tuck in one very quick question with Peter. If a provider has identified risk and has deployed risk mitigation strategies but has not completed the actions, where does the Commission stand and what action will be taken by the Commission at an assessment contact audit? Now, your team, your compliance team, doesn't actually do assessment contact audits. That is your colleague in another part of the Commission. But I want you just to deal briefly with that notion of work underway by a provider, because clearly what Elaine is asking here is, do you give standing to work in progress?
Look, thanks, Janet. And look, I'm going to be boring here again. You know, it's about, for us, about how that translates into the level of risk to the consumers at the time. And if there is actually work underway, what that will suggest to us is that the provider is moving in the right direction towards conformance. So that that will suggest that the level of risk is being controlled, even if it's not being completely controlled. And so that from us making a decision about whether we need to take enforcement action will obviously will feed into our risk assessment, because it should have moderated the level of risk that consumers are being exposed to, because there has been already work undertaken to move the provider back into compliance.
Thank you. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our time and indeed the end of our webinar. I hope that today's session has cleared up at least some of the questions you may have had about our approach to compliance. Just a quick reminder, there is a survey. You will be taken automatically to it. We would genuinely appreciate your feedback on how you found today's webinar and whether you have suggestions for other topics or other ways of addressing some of the content. Thank you very much to Peter, Amanda, Scott and Lucy. I think all of them have really made an important contribution to today's webinar. And thank you also to the many people who forwarded questions in the course of our conversation with the panelists. If we didn't get to your question today, we will ensure that information is provided on our website, and hopefully you know what the address is, agedcarequality.gov.au. There will be a video recording of this webinar available on this page in coming days. And finally, our next in our sequence of monthly webinars is on Tuesday, the 15th of August, when we'll be talking about prudential regulation. So please keep an eye out for the opportunity to register to participate in that webinar also. Thank you everyone for your participation today. We've really appreciated the opportunity of talking with you. Bye.